Hello! So today I'm going to show you how you can take an old black and white or sepia photograph and make it full colour, using only Gimp, which is completely free software and available on pretty much every operating system. For that reason I made this video. I want to remove as many barriers to entry as possible for those wishing to colorise photographs, and I feel Gimp has a somewhat bad reputation as not being as capable as its paid-for siblings such as Photoshop. I set out to prove Gimp could be as capable as Photoshop for colorisation, and opened up the program this week for the first time to see what I could do with it. With all that said, let's get to work. So the first thing that you want to do is desaturate your image. It may already look borderline desaturated, but it's always a good idea to make sure completely that it is. So now there's definitely no colour on this. The next stage is to do any adjustments we want to do to the contrast. In this case I can see that the darks are a little lighter than I'd like, so I'm going to go up to colours and use for this brightness and contrast. Levels and curves are both more advanced and have more precise controls, but to keep it simple today we're just going to be using this. So there, by altering the contrast I can bring that up. I think I'm also going to bring it up slightly in terms of brightness. But yeah, mostly darkening the contrast. I like that. I think that's a bit more, pops a little bit more. So we press OK on that. Now if you're working with a grayscale image, say from the Library of Congress, you might find that if you start painting now or using reference that the colours just aren't showing up for you, and that you have to go up to image mode and make sure that you're in RGB and not grayscale, because certain images have like colour formats stuck to them already and it might be in grayscale. You need it to be in RGB. So now we have our image prepped. Now you'll see here I have some other layers, and these ones are reference images. They're the same reference images I used in my Photoshop version of this, which I'm going to compare to at the end, but other than that, that's all they are, is images for reference, nothing else. So the way we're going to be choosing colours in this is to sample them. You don't have to sample colours, but I find it really helps easily get you believable colours. So when you're sampling from skin tones, you want to make sure that you're sampling from an area that doesn't have any particular shadows or highlights on it. So for example, on this man's face we have highlights here and shadows there, but using the method that we're using, it will lighten and darken the skin for us. So generally speaking, I mean you can go with shadows and it will lighten it up, but generally speaking we want to choose from somewhere that is about as bright as you can get on your skin before you can see there's obvious like exposure changes. So about there should be good for us. And what we want to do is go down and select a new layer, which we'll name, and we'll call this one Skin. And we want to make sure that the mode we're using is HSL Colour. That's very important. We also want to make sure that we're in foreground colour mode, because that will then fill the layer with our foreground colour up here. So we press OK. We can switch off our reference now. Now, at the moment, this looks rather intense. We're going to dial this down. But the next stage, before that, is to go over here to the new Layer Mask button and add a mask to it. And we want to fill it with black, which is full transparency. So now nothing is showing through, but our colour is still there, it's just being blocked out. The way you've got to think about layer masks, if you've not used them before, is almost like a window that's been blanked out. And so at the moment you can't see the pink through the window, but now we're going to, in essence, make a hole in the window so you can. And it uses black and white, like a film negative would, as this would, to change the amount of light that hits something. So we change our foreground colour to white and start to paint. You can see down here in our matte we have our white spot on our black, and on here we have our colour on our face. So in essence now you're just painting this in. You don't need to be too exact about it, because the method that we're using, for the most part, you can just kind of go over colours with other colours, but I think it's good just to kind of keep it neat for yourself, because then you can, as much as you can, things like the eyebrows we'll worry about later, but just so you can kind of get a shape of where things are going at this point. And if you do want to make any like precision adjustments now, you have to remember that this mask is currently white with black, and where black is you can't see. So you can paint black back in, and the best way to do that is to press the D key to reset your paints to black and white, then you can press the X key to switch between them. So with black selected, we can paint in to make areas invisible again, in essence. So we can quickly go through on areas where you want a bit more precision and detail and paint those out like that. Fill in any bits you've missed as well. So for now, that is a pretty good job on the skin tones. As I say, any bits you miss, you can always come back in with this system, and using layers and layer masks, even if you've moved on to another layer in the meantime, come back and make your changes as needed. So these colours are a bit intense at the moment, so what I'm going to do is make sure that I'm selected on the actual colour layer, go to Colours, Hue and Saturation, and here we now have controls for our hue, our lightness and our saturation, and that will just be applying to this skin layer. So the main things I see when I look at this are that it is far too saturated and that the hue is wrong for the colour. The lightness you can entirely ignore, that's being controlled by the black and white image underneath. So first up, I'm going to lower down the saturation to see if I can get something that looks a little bit more human. And then I'm going to try and tweak the colour a little bit to make it, again, more skin coloured, at least compared to my reference. So an important thing to remember is we're going to be painting in cheek colours, nose colours, you know, eye ring colours, lips, all these kind of things. This is just the base colour of the skin. So the general one you'd see on everyone if they were, you know, didn't have any blush or lips colour or anything like that. So I'm not going to spend too long tweaking it because we can alter that later. But I think that's a good starting point, so I'll press OK and I'll switch my reference back on. So with the skin in place, I'm now going to move on and do his jacket. So I'll switch on a different reference layer. It's always good to have your references in different layers, and choose from the reference I want to use, which in this case is this one. So we go over to our eyedropper. By the way, with your eyedropper, it's a lot easier to have sample merge switched on, because otherwise you actually have to be sampling from the direct layer you're on, whereas here I'm on the skin layer at the moment and I'm sampling from the jacket layer. So we sample our jacket colour. We can now switch off that reference. Now we do what we did before. We do new layer, we can call it jacket, and HSL colour and foreground colour. So again, we're using the HSL blending mode and we're filling it with our foreground colour, which is the jacket green. So we press OK. And now, once again, we hit our mask button and we make sure to fill it with black. So with that done, go up to paintbrush, we reset our colours, so we press D, and we want to be painting in white, so we press X. And now we paint that in. And the wonderful thing about this method is that in light patches the colour looks right, and in the dark patches the colour looks darker. It adjusts automatically to the colours underneath, or rather the luminance underneath of the black and white photograph. And you can really zoom in close and make minor adjustments as needed. Pressing X to switch your colour and switch back. When you're colorizing, you spend most of your life just pressing the X key as you paint. So now we have a jacket and a skin tone. And again, as before, I think that, oh, I missed a little bit on the jacket, just to demonstrate that you definitely can go back later, get back in and paint that. And you'll see now, if I wanted to, if I paint here, we get the jacket tone on the face, because it does work in terms of layers top to bottom. So you got to be a little careful with that, but nothing is permanent. So there we go. We now have what already, to be honest, looks pretty good as a jacket, but I do want to alter the colours slightly. So we go up to colours, hue saturation again. We can ignore the lightness and change the jacket colour to anything you want it to be, and lower the saturation a bit. There we go, I'm happy with that. So we press OK. Now we have the jacket and the base skin tone. Now I'm going to go ahead now and do the lower sort of shirt, the medals, the band around his hat and his main hat. And I'll do the skin tones and the background in a minute. I just want to show you quickly the wonderful thing of working in layers like this, because we now have a situation where our shirt layer, we want to colour in under the medals and underneath this coat. So all we need to do is put our shirt layer underneath our jacket layer, and now when I fill this in, it will automatically go behind both of them. So there we go, I can paint over here and it will do absolutely nothing, so you can be even less careful now. Okay, so with that lot done, we're now in a position where we have to move on to the colours that we're going to treat slightly differently. So there isn't really much difference here, it's all to do with how you blend it. So now we're going to do the lips. So I turn on my skin reference and I sample a colour from that. Again, you don't have to use reference, I just find it's a little quicker. The major difference in how I do the skin tones on the face is to lower the opacity rather than lower the saturation as much. This allows the colours to blend together, so when you have red cheeks and a slightly orange face, it'll look more natural. And with a big brush and a big soft brush, you can press X and kind of soften it down at the edges so it looks a little bit more natural in terms of how it fades. And with that in place, we can then lower the opacity down. Now in this case, I also want to make it a little bit more orange, so we'll go up to hue and saturation. Little tweaks. There we go. Now for the cheeks, we're going to do much the same starting point, but then we're going to do something cool to soften it out. Now with those painted in, what we're going to do is go up here and blur the layer mask, which is a neat trick. So we're now blurring this black and white image down here, which means that we can really soften where this cheek detail goes. And if I press OK, we now have nice soft cheeks, which again, I will tweak the colours of a bit. This is all down to personal preference, how you want your colours. So there we go. We now have cheeks, we have nose, we have lips. I think it's about time we did the ears, to be honest. So for ears, generally speaking, you want to kind of stick to the lines of the ear, I find. And we're going to be blurring this quite a lot, so you might want to bear that in mind in terms of your brush size and such. We'll move over and do the other side. And then we'll blur them. Again, blurring in the mask. And you'll see you get these kind of highlights. So press OK. And I think I'm going to be lowering the opacity of that a bit. And also tweaking the colour a tad. So, right, looking at it so far, I think we've got quite a nice image already. But there's still a lot more that can be done. We still have skin tones to add, we have hair to add, and a background to add. I quite like, and this is one nice thing about this method, is you don't have to focus on one particular part of the image at that particular stage. So while we've still got more face detail to add, I think I'm going to work on the hair for a slight break from that. So I'm going to give him brown hair. There we go. Hair. And we can start painting that in. And I'm going to show you a couple of really neat tricks with the hair. You can quite often, you'll have wispy bits like this, which are kind of hard to work with because, you know, they're sort of meant to be two colours really. And we're going to work with that. It's also worth remembering that we have this strap going round. So although you can't really see it, it is here in the case of this picture. So I've got to try and remember that and work with it. So what we're going to do is, rather than, we want to soften it, but we want to soften it in a far more directional way. So what we're going to do is go over here and grab the smudge tool, and we're going to scale it up, and we're going to drag where our white would be. So in this case where the orange is, and we can just drag our colours out gently. And we can also drag them in where we don't want them to be. This is a nice kind of smudging technique, as if you were using, you know, oil paints or something with a bit more tactile response. And we can just gently push these into where we want them to be and around the edge. If you get a small enough brush, you can obviously do very fine work here, but this is just to kind of show you the basics, and then you can put as much time into this as you personally wish. I can also do this on the eyebrows, actually. I should colour in just generally those. But this is an area where it really benefits from it, because obviously there's so much fine detail that you want to kind of be quite precise, more precise than I'm being, but again, this is just showing the basics. It's quite nice, you can just click and drag colours into place. So with those somewhat coloured in, we're going to adjust our colours for the hair. So we'll go up to colours, up to hue and saturation, and we know we want to lower the saturation because most hair is not orange. So that's quite a lot darker now, and we also want to add a little bit of yellow to it. And now we've got what I would call reasonably accurate hair. If you ever, by the way, if you can see what I'm doing every so often is I go up and select the eyedropper and then choose an area of grey, it's because for whatever reason in Gimp, all the separate windows have their own controls when you click within them, but sometimes you'll leave this window, go over to this one, and it will still activate this one. So in order to switch windows, I found that's the best way to work for me at the moment. I'm sure there's probably an easier way to do it, but that's how I figured it out for now. So now we have our hair done as well. We have our ear done, but I'm looking at the ear now and I'm thinking that's not, you know, oh, well, it's because it's lowered the opacity down. We want to up that opacity on the ear again. So we now have the basis of a pretty good picture, I would say. We have our hair done. And now that we have our hair done, I'm going to do the background. And it might seem strange to do the background this far into the picture, but the reason I want to do it that way is that light tends to bounce off things. So when you're working in a layer order like this, if you want your background to bounce at all onto your subject, it's good to put it on the top of the stack, or at least above the layers that it's going to interact with. So in this case, it's important that the hair was kind of in place and the hat was before I did the background. So I'm going to give it a nice blue background. Okay, so now we have to paint in our blue background. So we'll get a fairly large brush, not quite that large, and we'll zoom in and we'll go, and as you can see, you can go directly all over, but at the edges a little bit of colour bleed here is really not a bad thing at all. So now we have our background. I'm going to go through the same method again, just to lower the saturation a bit and maybe make it a little bit of a different colour. Obviously you can do whatever you want with this. I think I'm going to go with that actually, that's quite nice, quite fresh and exciting. So I'm going to add a bit of yellow to the face, which is quite important. Anyone's skin tone, regardless of how dark it is, tends to have a lot of yellows and oranges in it. So you want to kind of work those into your picture. A lot of the kind of where to colour comes in from experience. But broadly speaking, you've got to think about it in terms of red areas are where there's sort of blood collecting under the skin, so say your nose and your cheeks make sense for that, as do your ears. Yellow is generally areas where there's not so much blood, but there might be a little bit of fat, or sort of just generally, you know, gristly kind of material. So chin is an area where fat might kind of form, as is under the eye a little bit. And yeah, around the mouth. So with those in place, I'm going to blur them. Okay, and I can see that due to the blur, we've now got some areas that I want to kind of fix a little bit. Also, this colour of yellow is far too yellow, so I'm going to make it more of an orangey yellow. Too much. There we go, looks pretty good. So we press OK on that. So now we have the yellow bits. So the next step, I want to give him a bit of a 5 o'clock shadow. When you're colouring a picture of a man, it's important to remember that even if he's shaved, just under the skin, there's going to be loads of sort of hair follicles waiting to come out. And in colour, you can very faintly see that as a sort of 5 o'clock shadow. And the best colour to use for that is usually a bluey kind of greeny colour. And you're literally just painting a beard on someone as if you were drawing a sort of caricature. So you want to think, where would a beard be on someone? and you can usually connect it back up to the hair. And then add this. So you're just colouring in the beard and, you know, making it look as much like a kind of beard as you can. And now we're going to soften it. Not too much, because we still want it to be a visible line, but yeah. And now we've got to lower the opacity on this one an awful lot, because we only want it to be just about visible. That doesn't look too bad. As you can see, we now, it's still a bit too strong. You want it very faint, almost invisible. That looks pretty good. So next up is our eyes. We're going to go with dark rings around them first. This is one of those times where you can kind of, if you want, really amp this up, because you're dealing with a picture of a young man who's obviously been in combat, so you could, if you want, really darken these down a lot more than they are. You know, colorization is always a sort of battle between historical accuracy and trying to sell the mood of the original picture, I think. I tend to go for historical accuracy as much as I possibly can, but I've definitely seen some really good examples of people who've kind of emotionally sold the picture. Now I'm going to make these a little bit more bluey purple. Actually kind of like that. It's kind of intense. I will lower it down a bit. But yeah, so we've got some kind of darker rings around the eye. Now we've got to do the other big important bit, which works very similarly to the beard, where we add some blue under the eyes. Obviously the rules that I'm talking about here are sort of more the case in someone who's quite pale skinned like this, but even with darker skin tones you're still going to have, you know, oranges and purples and other colours coming through. So, you know, look at reference images, work out what you need to do in your particular case. Okay, so it's important that any image that you're colorizing, even if it has what looks like complete blacks and complete whites, there is always going to be a very slight tint to them in some way. So in the case of these eyes, although they look pretty good at the moment, they would be very slightly pink. So we're going to add that in. Obviously it's rather pink at the moment, so we're going to have to dial this right down. So let's lower this opacity an awful lot. So we're on maybe like 10% now. And if I switch it on and off, you'll see the difference is very minor, but important. Now we'll go for the blue of the eyes. And my very, very favourite bit of every single colorization I'm now going to do. So it's these little tiny bits just in the corner of the eye. They're a really nice little detail, I think. So with that, I think we've really filled in, well, two things. This is the problem when you're working, is that you do keep forgetting bits. I've still not done this chin strap, and I've still not done these button bits. So with the chin strap, we're going to have to reduce the saturation quite a bit to make it look correctly leathery. But yeah, there we go, we got that. And I want to lower the opacity on this one a bit, just so it's a subtle thing. And I think that is pretty much there. Now that is the kind of essential colour work. What I'll do now is tweak a few things. Tweaking's a big stage of it. On any picture I do, I would say tweaking is a solid third of everything I do, is just getting that tweak right. So the skin tones to me look a tiny bit desaturated, more than I'd like. So I'm going to up them a tad. And we'll okay that. I also think maybe the cheeks are a little bit too orange. So I'm fairly happy with those colours, at least for the purposes of this. So what I'll do now is tweak the actual brightness of the image underneath a little bit more. And I'm going to do that using curves, which you again can just do with brightness and contrast, but I want to get a little bit more manual control over it. So we'll kind of see if we can tweak it in any way that I kind of prefer a little bit. Like looking at this, I'd kind of like the bright bits to be a little bit darker. And maybe the shadows a tiny bit darker too. Yeah, We'll go with that. And the last thing that I think is a really nice detail to add is to colour the lighting. So this is the only time in this we're using a different blending mode. So we choose what is a nice kind of orangey light in this case. And we make sure it's on the top of our stack, otherwise we end up with a terrifying image. And we fill it with black. And now we need to kind of paint in roughly where the light is hitting. So it's more on this side. And we'll just paint over these. This is entirely an optional step, but I think it's kind of a cool one. And now we blur it, because we want it nice and diffused. And now we've got to go in and kind of erase the bits where it's not meant to be hitting, such as the background. So with that done, we now dial it all the way down. So now when I switch this on and off, you'll see we have a slight thing, but we need to change that blending mode, so we'll put it on soft light, and now we have a very soft light. And if you want to add to this effect, something that's kind of interesting, which I like to experiment with, is adding shadows in a different colour. And in this case we could add sort of a bluish shadow, but I actually kind of want to add, say, like a green shadow or something weird. You can get really experimental with this because it doesn't necessarily make sense, but it draws the eye and it weirdly adds a sense of realism to images sometimes. So we'll just add a little bit in the shadow areas, and then we dial this one again, we put it on soft light, and we dial that right down. And with that, I would say our image is done. Now this took me in total an hour and 10 minutes to finish from the start to the end. Admittedly, I've had a fair bit of previous experience creating colorizations in Photoshop, and I certainly wasn't this fast when I started. But Gimp has the potential if you sink the time in. I think this is shown. The main points I really wanted to get across from this video are as follows. 1. You don't need Photoshop or any other paid software to do colorizations. Photoshop is more user-friendly, has a few really nice tweaking options, and is less likely to crash in my experience, but Gimp really held its own overall, and I was impressed with how close my end result ended up to the Photoshop version. Not necessarily in exact colours, but in terms of end result quality. 2. I was able to learn how to use Gimp fairly quickly, using the knowledge I had from working in Photoshop. I can only imagine that if I'd started with Gimp and moved to Photoshop, I would have had a similar level of head start. So even if you're planning on switching to Photoshop in the future, any time spent learning Gimp before then is not going to be wasted time. The two programs are remarkably similar in how they function, even down to shortcuts on the keyboard. Anyway, thank you for watching. Please let me know in the comments if any of my advice was helpful, or if you know ways I can improve this method. I have other videos up on this channel if you'd like to check them out, and I also have more planned of various types for the future. So if you would like to subscribe, that would really help me out to build this channel. Goodbye, and thanks again for watching.